Lecture number 4, we're going to talk about some of the general functions of your white blood cells. You know what? Actually, I'm going to back up over here for a second. We were taking a look at the development pathway for the different blood cells in your bone marrow. Okay, so on this diagram over here, these are your main white blood cells we're going to be talking about. Your neutrophils, your basophils, your eosinophils, your monocytes, and then your T and B lymphocytes. Okay, those can be divided up into, I forgot to mention this on the last video lecture, but these can be divided up into two categories, your granulocytes and your agranulocytes. These three cell types here, your neutrophils, your basophils, and your eosinophils, fall into the granulocyte category. The monocytes and your lymphocytes fall into the agranulocyte category. And granulo is referring to granules. These are membrane-covered compartments inside these cells that store chemicals that are needed for their functions. So they have all these pre-made chemicals that they're going to use as signaling molecules or weaponry depending on when they need to respond. And they have them pre-made and stored inside these little granules so that they can release them right away when they get activated. The granulocytes, your neutrophils, your basophils, and your eosinophils have lots of these fairly large granules inside them, and so when you look at them under the microscope, they look spotty. You see spots inside those cells, and those are the granules where they have these various chemicals stored. Your monocytes and your lymphocytes are agranulocytes, and so you don't see, when you look at them under the microscope, they don't have all these distinct spots in their cytoplasms. So that's where that terminology comes from. All right, so the granulocytes are your neutrophils, your basophils, and your eosinophils, and we're going to talk first about the neutrophils. This is a very important type of white blood cell. So they're made in the bone marrow, just like all of your other blood cells are, and they are highly phagocytic. They're sometimes called bacteria slayers. They're also first responders, which means when you have an injury or an infection, these are normally going to be the first responders. They're the types of white blood cells that migrate to an area of injury and infection first. The reason for that, all right, if you look at them under the microscope, which we'll do in lab, they make up 60 to 70% of the white blood cells that are in your bloodstream at any given time. So it makes sense then that they're going to be the first responders, because when you have an injury or an infection, white blood cells get out of your bloodstream. They leave the capillaries that supply a tissue, the little microscopic blood vessels. They leave through a process called diapedesis. That's what's being depicted over here on this image. These little gold things here are supposed to be coccus-shaped bacteria, and this is a capillary here. And so right here and right here you see neutrophils that are squeezing their way through the walls of the capillary, and they're entering into surrounding tissues. That process is called diapedesis. And once they do that, these types of cells are programmed to start engulfing microorganisms right away, but they're especially good at engulfing and doing phagocytosis on bacteria. So if you don't learn anything else about neutrophil, which you should, but the key thing, keep in mind that they're bacteria slayers. They love to phagocytose bacteria, and they're your first responders. They swarm in first. Some other things you guys should know about neutrophils, some people call them PMNs or polymorphonuclear cells, and that's because of the odd-shaped nucleus that they have. That dark shaped structure right here kind of looks like a string of balloons. That's actually one nucleus. It's divided up into several different lobes that kind of look like a string of sausages or a balloon animal, and that's where the term polymorphonuclear comes from. Many-shaped nucleus, or PMNs is an abbreviation. These cells don't live very long, so they get released out of your blood. They enter areas where you have an infection. They do lots of phagocytosis, and they just live for a few days, and then they tend to die. Very strong activity against bacteria. A couple of terms you should be familiar with. Neutrophilia means you have elevated levels of neutrophils. That can be a sign of a bacterial infection often, because neutrophils love to phagocytose bacteria. If you have a bacterial infection, there are signals that are sent from the infected tissues back to your bone marrow, which tell the bone marrow, hey, crank out some more neutrophils so that they can swarm in here and help fight an infection. So neutrophilia, an elevated number of white blood cells, can be a sign of a bacterial infection. Neutropenia means low levels of neutrophils. And that can happen, if your bone marrow gets damaged for some reason. You might not be able to produce enough of those. Okay, this particular slide, neutrophils exiting the bloodstream, that's a YouTube video which shows some of this for you, and I'm not going to play that here on a video recording, but that would be good for you. If you go into the PowerPoint, you can play that YouTube video directly from the PowerPoint. It is interesting to watch. There's actually a recording of that actually happening. All right, then how about your basophils and your eosinophils? These are your other two types of granulocytes. So there's what a basophil looks like under the microscope, and there's an eosinophil, and you see all the spots inside there. Those are the granules. In the case of the eosinophil, the granules are so big, and with the dyes that are typically used to stain your white blood cells, they take on a reddish, purpley pink color, and they're so big you can't even really see the nucleus inside the cell. But if you look, these aren't very abundant. These numbers here, basophils, 0.5 to 1%. That means if you look at all the white blood cells in the blood as a group, typically only 0.5 to 1% would be basophils. Eosinophils, only about 2 to 4% would be those. These can also do diapedesis, so they can migrate into your tissues when needed. What the basophils do is they come into your tissues after an injury or an infection, and they're more or less monitoring, is this infection still going on? Do we still have damaged tissues here? Do we need to recruit in more forces to come out of the blood and into this tissue and help fight the infection? So that's basically what they do. They release chemicals that stimulate inflammation, the inflammatory response. Hey, keep coming in here, keep helping to fight the infection. You may have heard of mast cells before when you studied tissues in Biology 201. Those are basically kind of like basophils, but they're always stationed in your tissues, and that's their job. They detect injury and infection, and when they detect that, they have granules on the inside that are storing these chemicals that trigger inflammation, and so they'll send these signals out and get that inflammatory response rocking and rolling. There are lots of them that they release. We're not going to cover all the chemicals that are included, but a couple you should be aware of. Histamine is a chemical that causes vasodilation, dilation of blood vessels. If you're going to have inflammation due to injury or an infection, you got to dilate the blood vessels to allow more of a blood flow. And it also helps things in the blood, like your white blood cells that need to get out of those blood vessels and into the surrounding tissues. It helps them escape more easily. And then you have heparin. That's a chemical that actually prevents blood from clotting too quickly, which might sound kind of the opposite of what you would expect to happen. But at first, when you have an injury or an infection in a tissue, you don't want the blood clotting so quickly that white blood cells and other important substances in the blood can't get out of the blood and into the surrounding tissues to help fight the infection. Basophils are also thought to play some role in allergic responses, allergies, which we'll talk a little bit about at the very end of the unit. All right, then your eosinophils over here, they do phagocytosis to some degree. They're not as important as your neutrophils or your macrophages. When you're thinking about, what cells are phagocytic, neutrophils, macrophages are the big two. These cells, their granules contain chemical substances that are thought to especially play, well, not thought to, we know that they play especially important roles in killing parasitic worms. Unfortunately, many of those chemicals are toxic for our own tissues as well. So if you had eosinophilia, what does that mean? We just talked about neutrophilia, meaning elevated neutrophils. Eosinophilia could be a sign elevated eosinophils in your blood. Normally they're there about 2 to 4%. Let's say they're up around 8, 9, 10%. That can be a sign that you have a parasitic worm infection, because if you have a parasitic worm like a hookworm somewhere, signals will be sent to your bone marrow. Your immune system has lots of communicating molecules. If that parasitic worm gets detected, signals are going to be sent to your bone marrow. Hey, crank out some more eosinophils to come over here and help us fight this parasitic worm infestation. Eosinophils are also involved in allergies. So another reason why you might have too many eosinophils in your bloodstream is if you are experiencing an allergy attack of some type. All right, your agranulocytes, this means without granules. These include your monocytes, which if you look at those under the microscope, all these pinkish cells you see that are smaller, those are red blood cells. And then the larger one, like here, that's a monocyte. Has a kidney bean shaped nucleus. And you don't see the big granules in the cytoplasm surrounding the nucleus. This is a lymphocyte over here, and these are all red blood cells. So the typical lymphocyte is not much bigger than a red blood cell. That dark spot you see right in there, that's the nucleus. The cytoplasm is just this little sliver around the darker nucleus in the center. And lymphocytes don't have these big spotty granules either. So that's why they're in this agranulocyte category. What do your monocytes do? First of all, they make up about 3 to 8% of your white blood cells. Lymphocytes is 20 to 25%, but it can be as high as, it can be up in the 30s to even around 40% in some individuals. And keep in mind, these percentage values I'm giving you are just for the white blood cells. Red blood cells make up 99% of the cells in your bloodstream. But if you're just considering the white blood cells themselves and ignoring the red blood cells and ignoring the platelets, then monocytes would be about 3 to 8% of those. In the blood, these cells look like this, and they're called monocytes. When they get out of the blood and into your tissues, they become cells called macrophages that wander around and are very good at doing phagocytosis. So kind of as a rule of thumb, the neutrophils swarm in first when you have an infection, because they're the most abundant in the bloodstream. So their numbers are going to be very high when you have an infection going on early. The macrophages will come in smaller numbers, but they're very good at phagocytosis. And then, as we're going to see, they're going to play important roles in the third line of defense also. They help activate the third line of defense. And so do these dendritic cells that we've talked about before. They probably develop from monocytes. Some of the origins of dendritic cells are still not all that well understood. Then your lymphocytes, those are divided up into two major categories, T and B lymphocytes. They're involved in the third lines of defense. So we'll be talking about those later during the unit. There's a special type of cell related to lymphocytes. They look like big, gigantic lymphocytes, and they're called NK cells. And that actually stands for natural killer. That's kind of an interesting name. And we'll talk a little bit about what those do shortly. All right, macrophages are extremely, extremely important. And you have those, you have many parts of the body where you always have macrophages stationed because they're so critical to have around for doing phagocytosis. And then others are these wandering macrophages. So those are the ones that are monocytes in the blood, and they become wandering macrophages when they get into your tissues. But then this diagram, what this is showing you, this is from an earlier textbook that we used, is showing you different places in the body where you always have what are called fixed macrophages in place, and they need to be there to detect things like your old worn out cells and tissues, and also any microbes that may have invaded those tissues. And so those include, you can take a look at the diagram, but alveolar macrophages are always in the tiny air sacs called the alveoli in your lungs. Kupffer cells in the liver, they're there to intercept microbes that may be entering the liver from your digestive tract. If you get, and when you guys take Biology 202, you learn about how the liver, the blood that drains off of your digestive organs, before it goes back to the heart, it passes through the liver so the liver can filter it and process nutrients. The intestinal tract is a major portal of entry for lots of microbes. So since blood that is draining off of those digestive organs goes to the liver, it's a good thing that we have Kupffer cells there that can that are stationed there all the time that might be able to intercept microorganisms that are draining in off of the digestive organs. In the central nervous system, you have microglia. Those are like macrophages of the brain and the spinal cord that are always stationed there and ready to intercept microorganisms if they enter the brain and the spinal cord. Doesn't always work, but that's why they're there. And then we've talked about these dendritic cells as well. They're considered to be related to macrophages, and they exist in your skin and mucous membranes. And we'll also see they spend time in the lymph nodes as well. There's a term for the various macrophages and these dendritic cells. They're so important, in some ways they're considered to be almost like their own body system, and they're mainly located in your connective tissues, which have a lot of protein fibers in them and can look reticular. If you guys remember hearing that term before, when you hear reticular, it means web-like. So the protein fibers have kind of a web-like appearance. So you'll sometimes see reticuloendothelial system to refer to these macrophages in combination with the tissues where they're located. Which this diagram from your textbook is trying to show you that in a different way. Your reticuloendothelial system, because you have all these connective tissue fillers between your organs and other tissues in the body, plus you have the lymphatic system, your lymph nodes and lymph vessels and so forth, your tonsils and your spleen, which we'll be talking about more about later and reviewing those later. You have lots of these phagocytic cells, like macrophages and dendritic cells, living in these types of tissues. And they're so important, they're sometimes referred to as the reticuloendothelial system because they play such vital roles in protecting the body. Interestingly, this diagram, I kind of like this diagram from your textbook because it shows you the purple shading there is showing you where in your body you tend to have the most of these phagocytic cells concentrated all of the time. And they are located in areas where if microbes get in and get past your barriers, like your mucous membrane linings, like up here in the chest, around the lungs, for example, or down here around the reproductive and urinary tracts, those are great places to have cells stationed, these phagocytic cells stationed all the time to intercept invading microbes. All right, that's going to conclude lecture number 4.